Thank you, Austrian, for this nice introduction. So a few words about my lab. So it's a big new lab built on the Plateau de Saclay, which is in the south of Paris. So I'm a professor there, and I work mostly on energy harvesting, but not only, and mostly on MEMS, but not only. So I will focus my talk on application for medical implants, which is one example of application which is interesting to see all the facets of the development of energy harvesting devices, but it can apply to any application, of course. So first I will speak about the motivations of this work, what we need in terms of power to power those medical implants. I will give some detail about the available biomechanical energies for the pacemaker application. I will also present various transducers to harvest mechanical energy. I will give you some ideas of the problem we can have in this field regarding the reliability of the devices before giving you some prospects on the subject. So first, today we have really a large number of implanted devices, and it becomes larger and larger. And all these devices are powered by batteries. And the problem with batteries is that, to date, the lifetime is limited to about 10 years. And if it's long-term implants, we need periodical replacement of the implants. So the problem with that, it's not very comfortable for the patients. It's a bit risky for the patients also, and there are a lot of costs related to this replacement. So the question is, can we improve this device with energy harvesting? So first, let's have a quick look on the typical power requirements of different implants. So if we look at the most consuming ones, cochlear implants, for instance, it's in the range of 5 to 10 milliwatts. So it's quite a lot, I would say. And as you can see, they are sorted by decreasing consumption in terms of power needs. And if we go to the last one, it's the pacemaker systems. They require, the typical power requirements are between, let's say, 15 and 50 microwatts for classical pacemakers. And for the new generation of pacemakers that Professor Skandar-Basrour presented you just before, the power requirements is lower, it's below 10 microwatts. So of course, the most, if you want to address the power supply using energy harvesting, maybe it's better to start with the easiest application that consumes the less power. So let's see what changed in terms of progress for the pacemakers. So if we look at traditional pacemakers, the first implanted one was in 1964. It was a very big device, and the implantation was made possible by the development of the lithium battery technology, which enabled to have 2 years autonomy for this very large device. So this one. And then year after year, the size decreased, the power consumed also, the power consumption decreased, and in 2011, a new generation of pacemaker came, and it's a totally different pacemaker. Instead of being implanted under the chest, they are implanted directly inside of the heart. So we have this kind of Moore's law for pacemakers that enables to decrease the size, and then came a new paradigm, a new way to implant pacemakers. But in the same time, there were not much progress for the batteries, and because the capsule directly implanted into the heart is very, very tiny, the lifetime is also a little bit little. So to give you more details about the classical pacemaker, So you have here the capsule implanted under the chest, and then you have what we call leads. It's actually wires, and those wires are connected inside of the heart cavities. In the case of the leadless pacemaker that we can see here, the pacemaker capsule is directly connected to the heart muscle, and the electrode is just a little electrode at the extremity of the capsule, generate the electrical impulse to stimulate the heart. So it works like a classical pacemaker, but the capsule is only entirely in the heart. And I won't enter into the details, but it brings a lot of advantages compared to classical pacemakers. So as I said, the problem with these very tiny pacemakers powered by batteries is their very limited lifetime. And so after 6 years, they need to be replaced. And the problem is that it's very difficult to catch them inside of the heart. So the solution is to implant another device just nearby, and then to implant a third one, etc. But it takes room in the heart, and it can induce some disease after more than 3 implantations. And just to give you an idea, more than 30% of the implanted patients need a pacemaker for more than 20 years. So you can figure out the problem. So the question is it possible to put a tiny energy harvesting device in such a tiny capsule? So here is a view of the pacemaker leadless capsule, which is already on the market by Saint-Jude Medical. So you can see here kind of screw, so it's directly screwed in the muscle, in the heart muscle, and you have the stimulation electrode at the extremity of the capsule, and in the other extremity there is a kind of part to be attached to the tool that is used to insert the pacemaker into the body. So quickly, you can see here the tool used to insert the pacemaker into the vein. So they push it, and they monitor with a real-time radio imaging, and they insert it into the heart. And when it's well screwed, they release the capsule, and that's it. The capsule is in the heart, and it can stay there until the battery, for life actually, because we don't remove it. So the capsule dimensions are quite small, about 5 millimeters in diameter, and the length, depending on the manufacturer, are compressed between 30 and 40 millimeters. So it's not big, and most of the volume of the capsule is occupied by the battery. So if we want to replace the battery by an energy harvesting device, we have to analyze the energy resource. So if we look here at a real-time MRI scan of the heart, we can see that we have a lot of, apparently we have a lot of energy inside of the heart. So the classical figure is about 1 watt power in total. It means all the mechanical energy summed up gives to 1 watt. And if we look at this diagram, we can see how the energy is converted. We have the chemical energy, which is consumed to generate mechanical energy. We have electrical impulse that trigger the muscle contraction. And then the muscle contraction generates an increase of the blood pressure inside of the cavity, and then it generates blood flow into the veins. And in the same time, we have a kind of rotation and translation motion, a complex motion of the muscles. So the interesting thing is to analyze which kind of mechanical energy we could use, because we have a lot of possibilities here. And that was part of the job of one former PhD thesis in my group. So first, the idea was to analyze the fluidic energy. So can we harvest enough energy from the fluid flow, from the turbulence inside of the heart cavities? So this analysis was based on data that we found in numerous publications, medical publications, and from very rough models with different concepts for which we have analytical models, very simple ones, based on a volume of 1 cubic centimeter. We saw that finally, using all the fluttering and galloping devices that we imagined, the mechanical power was not enough for our application regarding the size, the room allowed for the device. So typically it was in the range of 0.5 microwatt per cubic centimeter. So it's not enough because we need at least, let's say, to power the device at least between 1 and 5 microwatt for this kind of device. So if you think about the loss in conversion, of course, we have almost nothing after conversion. The other approach was to say, okay, we have a lot of muscular force, and if we use this kind of device with 2 anchors, let's say 1 centimeter distance to the other, and when the muscle contracts, if we put a transducer here, we can convert energy. So based on a lot of data that we also found in literature, we estimated that it could be possible to harvest about 4 milliwatt per cubic centimeter. So it looks very interesting. So then we discussed with physicians, medical physicians, and we discussed about this concept, and they said, yeah, we have the experience of this kind of double anchored system. If you do that, after a few weeks, the muscle will stop contract in the region where the device is attached, because actually the body adapt and minimize the energy consumed. So it looked interesting, but we had to forget about it. So it's not viable. So we we moved to another analysis, which is the fluidic pressure variation inside of the heart cavities. So this is the time representation on a cardiac cycle of the ventricular pressure. You have here it's the blue curve, and you have a delta P, variation of pressure, which is actually a kind of quasi-static variation of pressure, and can be used to harvest energy, of course. So in the right ventricle, the typical delta P is 20 millimeter of mercury, and in the left ventricle it's 5 times more. But our application is more in the right ventricle, so we have to deal with the smallest pressure variation. So how can we harvest the pressure variation? We can harvest it using deformable capsules. That it looks like the most convenient way to get displacement and force, so energy. and if we so the deformable part is the blue one. So the most convenient for us look to have the extremity here that can be compressed. So if we look at 1 millimeter displacement of the mobile part of the capsule with respect to the rest of the capsule, and 6 millimeter in diameter, we can harvest up to 87 microwatt in the right ventricle, which is quite a lot compared to what we need. So we decided to start on this kind of device of system. But before that, we analyzed also the heart wall motion, and based on numerous measurements of acceleration inside of the heart cavity, we extracted this average spectrum, and you can see here a peak at the heartbeat frequency, and we have a kind of plateau in the range of 20 to 30 hertz. Due to the very low frequency here, if we want to really exploit this energy, it corresponds to very large displacements of a few meters. So of course it's not compatible with the Hertz dimensions. But in the range of 20 to 30 Hertz, it's more realistic. And if we consider 1 gram inertial mass, we can say that the rough estimation is about 25 microwatts per gram of inertial mass, mechanical energy, mechanical power, sorry. So it's a good way to harvest energy, and that's a large part of the results presented by Professor Skandar-Basrour just before. So let's come back to the blood pressure energy harvesting concept. So if we want to bring this into play, what we need first is a very, very flexible packaging, because we want to have large deformation and the pressure variation, the delta P, is not that big. So the diameter is less than 6 millimeter, and the stroke is about several hundreds of micrometers. So it means that the stiffness, if we make a rapid calculation regarding the pressure, the stiffness should be lower than 1,000 Newton per meter, which is relatively soft. Other constraints are the biocompatibility and, more importantly, the long-term hermeticity. Because for biocompatibility, we have a lot of polymers that are biocompatible, but for long-term hermeticity, the only solution is to use metals. You cannot use polymer in long term inside of the heart cavity. For more than a few months, it's not possible. So we started to investigate how to manufacture microbellows using nickel electroplating. So here is a description of the process. So first, we machine a mold of the microbellows, and then we deposit a thin layer of nickel by electroplating. So it's a conformal deposition. And then we etch the aluminum mold, and we get our microbellows. So you have here pictures of the mandrel, the mold. Here the system with the nickel electroplated on it, and then the microbellows when it's released. So once it was fabricated, first we characterized several samples to check that the force versus displacement is compatible with our simulations and our needs. So you have here several different slopes, because the process was not totally repeatable, not perfectly, but as you can see on the linear fit, the stiffness is between 135 and 300 Newton per meter, which is totally compatible for the application. So on the left side, you have a cut view of the microbellows. So you can see here the contrast is a little bit low, I'm sorry, but you can see the shape of the cut view of the microbellows, and some measurements at different places showing that the thickness of the microbellow is between 8 and 12 micrometers, which is not perfectly homogeneous, but the hermeticity was totally achieved, which was an important point. So then, once the microspiral concept was validated, we had to connect it to an adapted transducer. So we decided to design a piezo transducer. So if we first say, okay, we are going to just to connect the diaphragm, the problem is that the diaphragm is very rigid, so you have force but no displacement, so you have no input energy. So if we want to have displacement and input energy, we need to have something which is less rigid, and we decided to start with a microspiral. So this way we could maximize, we thought it was a good way to maximize the input mechanical work. And then we had to maximize the electromechanical coupling in order to have a high power density and good efficiency of the device. So that was a very interesting work. I won't give the full details on the design procedure because it's a bit boring, but I'll just show you here a finite element model that we did to study how it behaves. And the graph on the right gives the orange curve gives the displacement along this green line, and the blue curve gives the surface potential along the same line. And if you look at this, because now you are most of all you are experts in piezoelectricity, so you see that there is here inflection points. The problem is that in the inflection points you have a change of the sign of the stress, right? So you should have a change of the polarity of the voltage. But it's not the case. So here the 0 volt is here, so it does not correspond to the change of polarity. And here it corresponds to a maximum of voltage. So it's not a change of polarity at all. So Euler-Bernoulli doesn't work if we consider that it's equivalent to a beam. If we develop the spiral and we say it's a beam. So what is the problem here? Is it the simulation or what?
Is it the twisting of the structure?
Exactly. We have combination of flexural effect, but also torsional, and so it's a complex combination of stress. It's a little bit hard to analyze, and if you change a little the shape of the spiral, you change the number of arms, their lengths, the number of turns, etc., you get totally different results. So we tried to go to analytical modeling, but it was just a nightmare. So we said, okay, that's the way it is. We will run a lot of simulations and see what works better. So that's what we did, and we came to these three designs. So they are 5 millimeter in total diameter, so they are compatible with the diameter of the capsule. The first one is only 1 turn per arm and 2 arms, and then we tried 2 turns, 3 arms, and 10 arms, 10 turns, 1 turn, sorry. So this is made in bulk PZT, but it's micro machined by a femtosecond laser. So it's very, very nice tool, but very expensive. Takes a long time to fabricate. But the thickness of the PZT is 300 microns, so it's a bit thick. It's a bimorph. And the width of the openings made by the laser are only in the range of 20 micron, so it's quite good. So what you can see also on top of this device, on each device, it's you have some cuts here. So the cuts are not across the PZT, just the cut of the electrodes, because we connected electrodes to positive voltage and other electrodes to negative voltage. Okay, to sum the negative ones and to sum the positive ones separately, not to cancel all the charge of the device. And all along, it's not visible here, but all along the arms we have very small tracks, also micro machined by laser, to connect the electrodes, the one with the others. So it's a very nice system, which is not really standard micro machining, but nice one. So in theory we had good results, but in practice we had the results we had. That is to say, in the range of 4 to 8 microwatts per cubic centimeter, which is very, very small, very little. It is very little because the device is much less than 1 cubic centimeter. So the real figure is in the range of nanowatts for for this spiral. So we were so it's far below from the simulations. We concluded that finally the problem is that our simulations showed that the polarity change of the voltage is very sensitive. If I come back to this slide, the polarity changes are very sensitive to the actual dimensions of the device. In simulation, we could see that. So our hypothesis is that we designed the electrode based on simulations, but the device we had they do not behave like simulations. So that's why the results are so low. But we were not totally disappointed, and we moved to other transducers. So we moved to electrostatic ones. And maybe, I'm not sure you are all familiar with electrostatic transduction. So maybe I should give you some basics on that. So basically, a variable capacitance MEMS energy harvesting device, an electrostatic energy harvesting device, is a passive system. It's a capacitance. So basically, a capacitance is composed of two electrodes, and the distance between the two electrodes is changed by the motion of a mobile part in the MEMS. So you have a lot of different possible configurations to get that, but basically, if you consider gap closing geometry, which means the gap changes, the distance changes, but the surface of the electrodes are constant, you have this expression for the capacitance as a function of the X displacement of the mobile part. So you have here a schematic of this kind of device with comb electrodes, interdigited electrodes, that are used also for actuation, etc. So, from the point of view of the energy conversion, we have one variable capacitance whose variation depends on the mechanical motion, and this capacitance varies between a minimum value when the electrodes are with large distance, and a maximum value when the electrodes are very close one to each other. So the question is, how can we convert energy this way? If we apply voltage across these electrodes, and if we imagine that one of the electrodes is moved by the motion of a mobile mass, this is the case of an inertial device, we will have a transducer force whose expression is proportional to the voltage squared and the derivative of the capacitance as a function of the displacement. So this force slows down the mass and does negative work that we can calculate using this formula. And we can conclude that the electricity generated when the capacitance of the transducer is decreased. So in this case, the energy variation of the system is negative. So in practice, we provide the electrical charge in the beginning, and when we reduce the capacitance, we increase the electrostatic energy stored on this variable capacitance. Then we have to extract the energy, and that's the rest of the story. So to analyze the energy conversion from the electrical point of view, we usually analyze this in the charge voltage diagram. So we have here one line which corresponds to the minimum of capacitance when the electrodes are very far, and the other one which corresponds to the maximum of capacitance when the two electrodes are very close one to each other. So let's have a look to how we can transform energy. So first we apply the voltage up to a maximum value that we decide, and we go to the point A. When the capacitance is maximum, so the electrodes are close one to each other. Then, when the electrodes get very far one from each other, we have a reduction of the capacitance, and we keep, during all this transformation, we keep the voltage constant across the capacitance. Okay? Let's imagine that we can do that. And then finally, when we have a reduction of the capacitance, we come back to the initial point and we reduce the voltage to 0. So we have a complete cycle of the voltage charge diagram, and the surface of this cycle corresponds to the energy that we have extracted, we have converted from mechanic to electricity, from mechanical energy to electricity. So if we want to do that, we have to deal with this kind of circuit, which is very complicated and power consuming, and if we deal with microwatts in terms of raw energy, it's very difficult to bring this into play in practice. So we developed a much simpler interface circuit to bring the system into play. So this circuit is represented here. I will not enter into the detail of the way it works, but it's composed of passive elements. So we have only diodes and capacitors. So it's self-synchronized with the cycle. We don't have any active switch, and we don't have any inductor. So it's very compact and lightweight and integrable into a pacemaker. So if we look at the charge voltage cycles, we have actually, if we use only the first element, the first cell, we have this rectangle. If we increase the number of cells, we have larger and larger rectangles. But in the same time, we increase the voltage across the variable capacitor. So we have to find a trade-off between the surface of the cycle of the square and the voltage that we can apply on the microsystem. So there is a kind of trade-off to find. It's not complicated, but it's a constraint. So let's move to the electrostatics transducer that the first one that we decided to design. So it's a kind of stacked system with a lot of layers, and the red part is the mobile part. All the mobile part of each layers are connected together with a central pillar, and this central pillar is connected to the moving part of our microbellows. So when the blood pressure varies, it moves the red part of our microsystem, and the capacitor is composed of several layers of combs with a round shape, adapted to the shape of the capsule. So if we look into the shape of the comb structure, basically it's fingers, and we have a lot of variables to design these combs. We have the distance between one layer and the other one. We have the width of the combs. We have the gap distance between the moving and fixed combs. We have the height of the thickness of each layer. So it makes a huge amount of variable to optimize the design of the system. And once again, I won't enter into the details because it's a bit boring, but we can do it analytically, roughly. But just I want to explain the interest of this structure. Actually, this is the moving and fixed combs at rest. And when we move it, we have here the capacitance that decreases to a first minimum value. Then we turn to a local maximum, then to another minimum value, then to another maximum, and then to the last minimum value. So for the first one, we are we moved from this maximum to the first minimum. So we performed this beginning of cycle. Then we climbed up to this local maximum, and then we went. Sorry, that's a bit fast. And then we went down here. Okay, so we have a first loop. So this loop here corresponds to energy that is harvested. Then we start the second loop. So this is the second loop. And then finally, we totally close the loop here. And the harvested energy is actually the total loop plus the small loops inside. So if we design well the system, we can have larger Cmax and a smaller Cmin here, larger here, smaller here, and larger intermediate energy conversion cycles. So this way we can have very, very strongly coupled system with reasonable voltage. That's the idea, to increase the energy for voltage as low as possible. So now let's move to various shapes of capacitance as a function of displacement up to 1 millimeter for various parameters, various gaps, various lengths of the finger lengths, and if we vary that, we also vary the number because we have a constrained volume. So actually when we vary the two things, we vary actually all the rest of the variables. So we have here, we can see on the black line with a gap of 7.5 micron that we have large Cmax and Cmin and numerous. And if we go to 30 micron, it's almost like if it was only one layer. We don't take advantage of the numerous layers. Okay. So of course, the conclusion is that we should get a gap as small as possible. And if we look at the power density, depending on the design, it's possible to harvest in the range of 50 to 200 microwatt per cubic centimeter using this design. So it's pretty okay regarding what we have in input. So now I will give you some details about the process. The fabrication process, actually, it was one of my main motivation to do that. I was not convinced that of the interest for the application, and you will understand why, but I like very much this process. It's like a 3D printing. It's a layer by layer process, but you have 1 micron resolution. So you can really build 3D microsystems with a very high resolution and in 3D. So I will show you how it works. So first we make a mold, which is basically a photoresist pattern, and we fill the mold with nickel. Okay, so it's first layer. So the lateral resolution is the resolution of photolithography, so it's very accurate, and the thickness is the thickness you want. If you want large thickness, you use thick resist. If you want thin layer, you will use the adapted resist. Okay. Once it's filled, you electroplate copper on the whole wafer, but then you have mountains. Okay. So then you have to polish the wafer in order to remove all these mountains and to see copper and nickel. Okay, so you will get this, and then you just have to repeat photolithography. You can change the mask, so you can change the design, and that's the way you can get a complex 3D shape. You just have to take care of the alignments if you want the system to be well connected, and you repeat those steps as much as you can. And once you're bored about that, you stop, and you release the nickel microstructure by chemical etching. So it was really seducing way to build complex systems. In practice, it's a little bit complicated. All the steps are complicated. And the most important point is that it takes very long time to get one layer.
To get one layer?
One layer. So it's something like, if we do it in our clean room, not an industrial process, but to get one full layer perfectly done, it's more than 3 days. Just for one layer. That's a photograph of the 10-layer sample. So we don't see exactly but it's very thick. Huh? So you have the springs all around. So I did not speak about the design of the springs, but it was also huge work to reduce the stress and to have, I would say, a good motion, not rotation, etc. So it was not easy. And you have the system of combs inside of the round. So here you have points to attach the microbellows, the mobile part, and the fixed part is simply bonded inside of the capsule. Okay. So that's a photograph of the device. So it's 5 millimeters in diameter, and here you have a test of the springs to check that after thousands of 1 millimeter displacement, there was no problem. Actually, we were not patient enough to break it, but it never broke. That's a good point with metal compared to other materials we can discuss, but it's very robust, I'd say. So if we apply a heartbeat on this system, including the stiffness of the capsule, we estimated that the theoretical performance was about 3.5 microjoule per heartbeat neat power after the circuit, with all the loss, etc. So it looked pretty acceptable for this 10-layer sample. But we couldn't show it in practice for several reasons. If you want, we can discuss about that, but we didn't get any microwatt with this device. But in this project, fortunately, we had some partners that worked on piezoelectrics, and this works pretty well. And it was, so I had to add this slide because Professor Skandar Basmo spoke about the aluminum nitride developed by Tyndall, so I had this slide during his talk. So this, in the same time, they developed a flexible piezoelectric material deposited on polyimide. So it's ALN on polyimide, and you have in this table different figures, and in particular the D33 and the D15. And you can see that before their work, it was for the D33 it was 56 picometer per volt, and they came up to 1.12. The D15 was not mentioned, and they measured 0.8 approximately. So it was state-of-the-art result. But if we look at the figures on silicon, regarding for the D33 is much better. So they decided to keep this kind of substrate for the device, which is here. So you have the device that they developed. It's composed of 2 cantilever. So this is the inertial mass here and there. So it was not based on the microbellows for the actuation. It was based on the motion of the capsule. And you have here a view of the device inside of a transparent capsule. It's not titanium, of course. It's not metal, but it was just to show that it fits into the good dimensions. So it worked, and we had something to show to the European Commission at the end of the project. That was a good point. But we learned we learned a lot on this process, and now we have a lot of know-how, and we know what we have to solve to make it work. So after this experience of 3D fabrication of electrostatic devices, we said, okay, it's interesting, but it's very expensive. So we should develop a cheaper technology. So we moved to silicon on glass technology. Basically, it's a wafer of glass, and on top of it, you have a wafer of silicon, and the silicon is the active device that you can machine using standard micro machining in the clean room. So we also switched to inertial devices because we thought it was also easier to integrate in a capsule with a higher chance of reliability for the capsule itself, actually. So that's a schematic view of the work of Bogdan Vysotsky, who defended his PhD in 2018. So you have the seismic mass, the system of combs, the springs, and the circuit I showed before to help converting the electricity and to give it to the battery. So one part of his work focused on the design of the springs, which is something not that obvious. And the idea that we brought into play was to get a large displacement with a small applied force. And if you think about resonance frequency, actually, you get a low resonance frequency for a given mass if you have a very small stiffness. And if you remember about the acceleration spectrum I showed before, we need a small resonance frequency in the range of 20 to 30 hertz if we want to have a resonant effect in the system. And of course, if we have a resonant effect, we have an amplification of the energy conversion, and it's beneficial for the application. And the problem with the system is that we have a limited space in the capsule, and the system is in silicon, so we don't want to have shocks. So we wanted to have kind of stoppers, but not induced by shocks, induced by the non-linearity of the springs itself. Okay, so we wanted to have a very hard change, a very strong change in the slope of the spring to stop the motion of the system. So we started the design by considering bistable structures. If you want, I will explain why bistable are not suitable for pacemakers, but after. So if you consider bistables, you have curved beams, fixed anchors on the substrate, and moving mass. The mass is guided by the curved beams. So the beams are curved by design. That's the most convenient way to do it with MEMS technologies, because we cannot apply pre-stress to get a bistable effect like in a centimeter scale device. And typically we have this shape for the force versus displacement characteristic, and we have two stable points at zero force. Okay, so when you have this kind of force and displacement, this is unstable. So if you push the system here, you will go to this point, and if you push the other side, the system will go to this point. So you have bistable system basically. So we don't want that. So the idea here was to add a linear spring to change the slope of the total characteristic of the force displacement of the system. So you have different slopes for different stiffness of this linear spring. So then once we have obtained the appropriate slope, we went to the design, the practical design. So you have here the set of bistable beams and a linear spring on top of that. So with this design, we had what we wanted to have, but then we thought that it takes a big room in the MEMS and we thought about how to reduce the size, and we developed a mathematical approach to combine several modes of the system to shrink the system. And then we work a little bit on the optimization, and we showed that it's possible to divide the size by more than 2, the total surface, with almost the same characteristic. So it was a good approach for the design. And what we had to design in addition to that was the system of comps. So you have here the mobile part, the fixed comps, and you have all those fingers that will make the variable capacitor. Okay. So the idea was to optimize and to find a way to have a very narrow gap when the fingers are in front one to each other, the mobile part and the fixed one, and to have a very, in order to have a large capacitance, and if possible to have a very small capacitance at rest. So that was not very easy to get that because of the limitations of the deep RIE process in silicon. So you know that you have aspect ratio when you want to have a deep etching, especially if you consider 200 micron silicon. You cannot have very difficult to have 1 micron gap in this situation. But we found a good way to have 3 micron gap on 200 micron thickness, which is not bad if you consider the size of the system, the fact that the motion is not perfectly guided, so there is a risk of circuit, short circuit. So it's yeah, it was not. We were not sure that it would work, but it worked pretty well. So finally, the silicon on glass technology was very interesting for one electrical aspect, which is the very small parasitic capacitance of the system, which is also very important to get high performance with this transduction method. On the left, I didn't detail this, but on the left side you have a detail of the experiment we did to verify our models regarding the force displacement characteristic that we could get. So you have here a tool that apply a displacement and measure the reaction force. So it's a quasi-static movement. You have it's the static response of the system that you get this way. So a few words about the technology, the fabrication process. So first, we start with this silicon on glass wafer. We have one mask to define the silicon design. Okay, only one mask. We have one deep RIE etching through the silicon, and when we have finished with that, we have almost finished with we are done with technology. It's finished. We just have a very easy step of electrode evaporation through a shadow mask that we reuse. So it's very quick process. And we have HF glass etching, which is also very fast, to set the mobile part free. Okay. And once it's done, we just put this on the test bench, wire bond, and we can check the performance of the system. So finally, to compare to the previous process, which is very nice and enables to get very nice 3D structures, this one is very limited in terms of design, but it's very cheap, and you can do your MEMS in one day, actually. If you are well organized, in one day you get your MEMS. So it's the fastest process. I know. You cannot make it faster. So it's cheap, and we think that it could be easily transferred to industry. So I'll show you a few devices. So that's the device with bistable and linear compensational spring, and you can see the difference in size with multimodal, what we call multimodal. It has exactly the same characteristics in terms of force displacement, but it's much smaller. And we have the same kind of electrodes. It's called gap overlap, and it's a forest of very thin fingers. So we have a lot of them, and the only maybe the tricky point is to make sure in the only lithography we have, the only photolithography, that we have all the fingers perfect, no defect, because we don't want that the mobile part will be stuck with the fixed one. So and finally, once it's finished, you have here the MEMS on the shaker. So this is the axis of the shaker. 2 euros coin to give you an idea of the dimensions. And that's the way we test it. So if we apply a typical Hertz acceleration using this shaker, and we connect the MEMS to the circuit I mentioned before, you have here the voltage. So first we initiate the system with a very small voltage, a few volts, and you have the voltage across the capacitor, the storage capacitor, as a function of time. And after 25 seconds, we reach a maximum of the voltage, and then what happens is that the system is stopped due to the electrostatic force, which is too strong and stop the motion of the system. It's a non-linear effect, so the shape is not progressive. So what we can understand from this slope is that we must maintain the voltage below 40 volts to get a continuous operation. And if we calculate the slope here, we have the average power that is provided, and it is in the range of 2 microwatts for this very small device. So the performance is totally acceptable. So the power density, if we consider heartbeat, is about 70 microwatts per cubic centimeter. And if we apply harmonic vibration, which is not the case of the Hertz, of course, but for other applications, we can have up to 220 microwatts with the same voltage. So we also designed a very large device to see if, so this kind of device does not fit into the pacemaker, just to see if a giant MEMS would also work. So you have here a 4-inch wafer with only 4 giant microsystems, and then after dicing and assembling of the proof mass, we could test it and show that it works also pretty well. So you have here, so it's not non-linear springs here, it's linear ones, it's folded ones. You will see a movie after. And you have here a cross-section, same view of the electrodes. So 200 micron in height, 23 micron in distance. So the machining is done when the electrodes are apart from each other. But when they enter, because the finger width is almost the same as the opening, we have a very small gap. So that was the trick to get a small gap with a reasonable aspect ratio, because the aspect ratio of the etching is in the range of 10, which is the limit that we can do in a repeatable manner in our clean room. So you have here movies. So it's a stroboscopic movie. The resonant frequency here is about 40 Hertz. And you can see the mobile mass. And one side of the MEMS, you have the same on the other side. And the folded springs. I don't know if you have a zoom here. So you can see the deformation of the folded spring. So it's a linear one on this giant system. And you have mechanical stoppers at the end, on each end. So of course it's not as robust as the one with strong stiffness to stop the device. And the total displacement here is in the range of 500 micrometer. So it's large. Really, it's a large displacement with regard to the 3 micron gap we have. 3 micron gap and 500 micron displacement is quite a lot. So if we look at the performance we have got in this work, so you have all the other work we know, the best ones. You have here the volume of the device and here the power density. So if we consider heartbeat, we are here. But if we consider harmonic excitation, we are more in this range. Okay, so we are slightly above the best ones, but not much, just a little. So it means that this solution to etch the fingers at rest, not engaged, out of the mobile part, out of the fixed one, was a good approach. So now we still have work to integrate the system into the capsule. It doesn't fit perfectly with the dimensions, so that's an artist's view of what we should do to put. Actually, you have here the capsule, and you have two devices, two MEMS, one back to back. Actually, they are in the capsule. So if the capsule is 30 millimeter in length, you have enough room inside to put the electronics and 6 months energy storage, and the rest of the capsule for the energy harvesting MEMS. So if you look here, you can see that the motion on this artistic view, the motion of the mobile mass is this one, but maybe it's not the best idea. Maybe it would be better if it would be this one. Okay, but it's possible to combine them actually. We can make one MEMS designed for this direction and the other one designed for this direction. We can combine actually, depending on we don't actually, there is something we don't know exactly, it's the motion of the capsule. So we have acceleration, but acceleration data, but they were obtained using accelerometer, and the accelerometer does not behave exactly like the capsule itself. So okay, so I will go to the last part of this presentation. So Professor Skandar-Basro gives some words about reliability, and the reliability of the device is really one of the most important issue. If you think about 20 years work, 20 years operation of a MEMS, or 25 years, you really have to make sure that it will work that long. So we performed reliability studies on the system, on the piezoelectric device that was designed by TIMA laboratory in the framework of a project funded by the French National Research Agency. So the cantilever itself was presented, but I show it again. It's here. It's composed of a very thin piezoelectric beam. It's a PZT bimorph made of bulk material thinned by mechanical etching, mechanical grinding. Sorry. And this is the tip mass, and this side is bonded on the capsule. So it oscillates. So you have here an artist view of the cantilever beam, the proof mass, and the capsule all around with the electronics and the screw to attach the pacemaker to the heart. And this is an X-ray image, real time, where you can see the capsule with the cantilever beam inside. I don't remember if it was the heart of a sheep or a pig, but an animal with the heart similar to with same size similar to the human one. So the objective is more than 20 years operation of the device, which means approximately 600 million heartbeats. And if you have a resonance system, you will have, of course, a multiple of these 600 million heartbeats in terms of oscillations. let's say if you consider 3 oscillations, 4 oscillations, 5. It depends on the way you extract the energy from the cantilever. If you can extract the energy very efficiently, you will have only a few oscillations, 2 or 3, 4. But if you can't extract the energy very efficiently, you will have a lot of oscillations after each heartbeat. And this will increase the aging of the system. So to study that, it was not possible to make a system that will try the cantilever beam for 20 years. We cannot wait that long to say, okay, it will work. So we have to think of a good way to accelerate the aging effects. And the idea that we brought into play was to accelerate the motion of the cantilever. So we just removed the proof mass, and we designed a system that reproduced the same deformed shape as the dynamic one with the mass. So you have on the right, you have an image of this system. So the cantilever is clamped here, and it's just gently held at its extremity here in order to enable the rotation of this extremity, and this reproduces perfectly the dynamic shape of the system. And if we consider a reasonable number of oscillations, we can say that we have approximately 30 times acceleration factor compared to real use. So what we get actually for real is this kind of signal. We have 1 heartbeat, oscillation, and then almost nothing, and then oscillation, and then almost nothing. So if we count 3 useful oscillations, and then it's damped, we have this figure in terms of acceleration factor. So that's an image of the system. So you have below you have a shaker that moves this part, and on the top of this part you have a batch of cantilever that are strongly attached at one end, and you have all the systems to capture the mobile part in an appropriate way, and all the electrical connections to measure the voltage and the electrical characteristics of the cantilever. And also you have one force sensor on each clamping system in order to monitor the mechanical characteristic in real time. And you have also a displacement sensor in the middle that monitors the relative displacement of the clamped side and the free side. So this is put into a chamber at 40 Celsius degree temperature, which is very near from the body temperature. And you have here a display of the monitoring system. So you have a computer, a batch of electronic cards that can monitor all the parameters, mechanical and electrical, and a software which controls the system to regularly measure all we want to measure for 1 year, let's say. So the typical duration of the test is about 1 year. 1 year, 1 year and a half. To have the equivalent of 20 years, yeah. But it's a bit complicated actually. It was the first test bench. Now we are developing a new one because we are continuing in this direction for a company that develops this harvester. So we are going to develop a bigger test bench, but the first idea was to assess the reliability of the test bench itself, because that's actually the main problem is to make a test bench that is reliable enough to do the aging test, and that's really a huge challenge, but it worked. So what we measured actually, we measured the piezo capacitance, the open circuit voltage, the power generated on a resistive load, the blocking force of the piezo. So you stop the system, you apply a voltage, and you monitor the force at the extremity. And we measured also the mechanical stiffness in open circuit, doing just a displacement and measuring the reaction force. So with all these measurements are actually needed to understand what happened to this sample that stopped working. Because that was the idea, to understand well the weakness of the samples. And that's very important to understand where the problem comes from to solve it in an efficient manner. And most of the time we had problem with connections. I mean these wires. These wires that disconnected due to vibrations. When you have vibration, it makes mechanical fatigue to the wire. So we had a lot of problem with that. So you can solve it. Once you see it, you can, okay, I'll stop the system and I fix. But some problems we could not solve, of course. We had the cracks, the lamination of the electrodes. Once it happens, the sample starts dying. We also had the depoling of the piezo material on some samples. We have global mechanical edging of the piezo beam. We did not know exactly what it was, but it did not work anymore. We have cracks in the piezo, and we have also total rupture of the beam. So we observed all these defaults. After 1 billion cycles, we had 5 samples still alive. And after 20 years, so 1.4 billion cycles, we had only 3 samples that were with almost similar characteristics as in the beginning. So it's not a lot, but it's encouraging anyway. Just to show you a few data from obtained from this test bench. So it was a preliminary test before we start the long-term run. So it was only a few millions of. So you can see here the voltage. So it is the RMS voltage, and you have here the number of cycles. So you can see different behaviors. You have for the purple curve, you can see that the voltage is very stable. Okay, and then suddenly comes to 0. If you see the blue curve, you have a progressive decrease of the voltage. If you see the red, it's a little bit different. It's kind of chaotic like that. If you look at this blue one, it's quite similar to the purple one. The voltage. So when you have these results, you don't know what happened. Okay? You have to check all the other data. The piezo, to check if the piezoelectric activity is still there, to check the capacitance, to check the wire connection. It's the first thing you do actually. Optical inspection is not always efficient to see the cracks. So sometimes you just have to remove the samples and make cut views to understand what happened. So it's not very obvious, but in most of the case, here, now when I see this kind of curve, I know that it's just wires. So, yeah, another image of what we can get from this data analysis. You have here all the samples, and you have a view of the evolution of the capacitance versus time. So when you see that, you can say that some samples kept the same capacitance almost all the time, and for some of them the capacitance was divided by 2. So you can get some conclusion with that. It's not always so relevant, but you can imagine that one of the electrodes disconnected because it's a bimorph. So if you lose one connection, you divide the capacitance by 2. They are in parallel actually, the two sides. So it's also sometimes you okay, you know, I know what happens, but then you check and it's not that. So the analysis is not always that obvious. So in conclusion, so we have investigated. I did not show all the MEMS devices that we investigated to answer this question of powering medical implants, but I showed you the most interesting ones. We also tried up frequency conversion on MEMS, which did not work as expected, but it was also very interesting. We get actually totally other results for other applications, but for energy harvesting it was not not that good. And so in the different approach we followed, finally we came to the conclusion that very classical solution, technology speaking, could really go in a short time to the industry for this application. I did not speak about power management, but we worked also a lot on power management circuit for piezo and for electrostatic. And finally, we expect that one of these devices will be used soon for, let's say, preclinical tests, in addition to the piezo that are already in preclinical tests. So finally, we can conclude that implantable piezoelectric energy harvesting devices are really a key enabling solution because they enable to get smaller devices, to get larger autonomy, and to reduce the surgical risk for the patients. But of course, as you know, it's a full ecosystem. You cannot study the transducer itself. You need to consider all the system, including the electronics, power management, and the energy storage. So it's a more complicated story than the one you had now. So if we consider this device, the main challenge we have to solve are the performance, the reliability of the device, and of course the cost of the system, which is important if you want to go to the market, if you want someone to take your solutions to do something for, I would say, industrial prototype devices. So it means that it explains why we came to a very mature solution instead of the very interesting ones we had in mind in the beginning, because the industrial maturity is also very, very important. But for research, we can imagine, we are researchers, so we can imagine, we are free to imagine various solutions that, if we don't really care about applications, we can imagine many things. So you have examples of the imagination of researchers.